Welcome. I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. I'll be moderating this event along with Jason De León, who will join us shortly. The Beyond Borders Symposium is the last event in a partnership between SAR, Site Santa Fe, and the Center for Contemporary Arts Santa Fe. You can learn more about the partnership and view recordings of our previous events on our website, sarweb.org. I'd like to start by thanking SAR's Board of Directors and our members for their support. If you're not already a member of SAR, we'd like to invite you to join us. There'll be an opportunity to do so after the program ends. I'd also like to thank the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Santa Fe Community Foundation, and Louise Lamphere, Sarah Alley Manges, and Maureen Davidson for the direct support of the Beyond Borders programming. This collaboration across organization exemplifies what a meaningful partnership can look like. Today's speakers represent a diverse range of approaches to studying U.S.-Mexico border issues, communities, and policies. Our focus on these issues is consistent with SAR's commitment to giving voice to experts who can speak credibly about matters of public concern. We'll hear from the speakers for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a dialogue and take questions from all of you for about 20 minutes. So basically the prepared programs will last almost an hour, and then we'll enter Q&A mode. We'll take as many questions as we can with the idea of closing the event at about the 75-minute mark, perhaps a little bit later than that, depending on the volume of questions. Now I'd like to introduce today's participants in the order you'll hear from them. Jason De León, SAR's 2013 Weatherhead Fellow, is the curator of Hostile Terrain 94, an exhibition that is now part of Site Santa Fe's Displaced exhibit and will soon be showing at scores of locations around the world. You'll hear about the installation as part of Jason's presentation. He's professor of anthropology and Chicano studies at UCLA. His interests include archaeology, ethnophotography, and forensic science. He was named a MacArthur Fellow in 2017. Ieva Jusionyte is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Harvard University. She's the author of the 2018 book, Threshold: Emergency Responders on the U.S.-Mexican Border, which examines the pressures experienced by first responders working under heightened security on both sides of the border. C.J. Alvarez is Assistant Professor of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, and was an SAR Mellon Fellow in 2019. He's the author of Borderlands, Border Waters, A History of Construction on the U.S.-Mexico Divide, published in 2019, which explores the history of the construction projects that shape the region and current debates about the region's future. Deborah Bain is Professor of Anthropology and Gender, Race, and Identity at the University of Nevada, Reno. She was a research associate at SAR in 2013. She's the author of Returned: Going and Coming in an Age of Deportation, published in 2016, and co-editor of Illegal Encounters: The Effect of Detention and Deportation on Young People, published last year. We'll begin with Jason De León.
Oops. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you talking about immigration, migration, and the politics of this issue in this current pandemic moment. As Michael Brown said, I am Professor of Anthropology, Chicana and Central American Studies at University of California, Los Angeles. And I'm also the director of the Undocumented Migration Project, which is a 501c3 organization based in Los Angeles that is a combination of research, education, and arts. So it's a collective that tries to both document and raise awareness about migration issues, largely between Latin America and the United States. The Undocumented Immigration Project is currently curating an exhibition called Hostile Terrain 94, which I will talk about in a little bit. That is part of the Beyond Borders series that has been so generously sponsored by SAR, Site Santa Fe, and CCA Santa Fe. And so I just want to thank all three of those organizations very much for the tremendous amount of support that they have given us, especially during these trying times. The Undocumented Migration Project, from a research perspective, since about 2009, I have been very interested in trying to understand the experiences of undocumented migrants crossing from Mexico into the United States. The work involves, the research aspect involves a combination of approaches. So archaeology of the contemporary, what that means is for many years, I spent time conducting archaeological surveys in the Sonora Desert of Arizona, collecting the objects that migrants have left behind. So shoes, backpacks, water bottles, personal possessions, and treating these objects as I would any traditional set of archaeological materials. And so they're archived, they're curated, they have been studied and written about in various ways. And for me, the archaeology of undocumented migration is very much an examination of America's immigration history happening in real time. And so we have worked very, very hard to preserve this very ephemeral fingerprint and find ways to draw the connections between America's immigration history, whether that be Ellis Island or the Trail of Tears, or the trauma of other forced migrations that have characterized our history, and drawing those connections and parallels with the experiences of migrants from Latin America. The objects themselves have been the subject of various both writings and public media pieces, as well as lots of exhibition work. Between 2013 and 2017, we curated an exhibition called State of Exception, which featured many of these objects, including a giant wall of about 1,000 migrant backpacks that were that had microphone speakers embedded inside of them, playing the voices of migrants and telling their stories. If you're interested in those materials, you can find that on the internet in various places. Also, as soon as we get back to some level of normalcy and museums start to open, you can see some of these materials on display at the American History Museum at the Smithsonian Mall in Washington, D.C. Other parts of our work has involved a deep commitment to ethnography, so working with living migrants, conducting oral histories, trying to understand their experiences through work in migrant shelters, on migrant trails across Mexico, through deportation and post-deportation. And so I've spent a lot of time working with folks in those different contexts and trying to understand what it is that they're going through. In addition, we've conducted quite a bit of forensic work, trying to understand what happens to the people who die while migrating, the thousands of migrants who have died while crossing the Arizona desert, the South Texas backwoods, and increasingly those who are traversing Mexico from Central America to get to the United States. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to raise awareness about the deaths and disappearances, as well as using experimental forensic studies to document what happens to bodies and the rapid rate at which they disappear in places like the Arizona desert, and what those implications are for our ability to document the number of migrant deaths. My current research project is a 5-year study, or still ongoing study, of human smugglers, largely young men from Honduras, who are working to transport other Central American migrants across the length of Mexico. So I'm currently writing a book called Soldiers and Kings that examines the lives of these young men and tries to understand both how one becomes a smuggler, as well as the larger structural forces that shape the world of smuggling and make it, in fact, a great necessity for thousands of people, if not millions of people around the globe. And be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Most recently, I have been involved in a long-term exhibition called Hostile Terrain 94, which is a global participatory installation that's designed to raise awareness about migrant death in the Arizona desert, as well as connecting those deaths to the deaths of countless others who are also caught up in our global migration crisis. Hostile Terrain 94 focuses on a Border Patrol policy known as prevention through deterrence. And this is a policy that's been in place since 1994 that attempts to funnel migrants away from urban ports of entry, places like El Paso, San Diego, Nogales, so urban zones, by heightening security infrastructure in those zones and forcing people to try to cross the border in more remote, depopulated, and also relatively unguarded areas. The idea is that if we can force migrants out into a place like the Sonora Desert of Arizona, they will be forced to walk, upwards of a week or 10 days through a barren landscape characterized by extreme environmental conditions, where it's imagined that these environmental conditions, hyperthermia, that can cause things like hyperthermia, dehydration, rattlesnake bites, all the things that one could experience while hiking unprepared in these extreme conditions, will in fact serve as a barrier to migration. That's been in place since the Clinton administration. It continues to be our current border security paradigm. It plays a more important role than any type of border wall or other structure or infrastructure that we have along the U.S.-Mexico border. And it has led to the deaths of thousands of people, knowingly led to the deaths of thousands of people. So in the beginning of this policy, it was recognized that if we funnel people out into these regions, that there would be a dramatic rise in migrant death. And we went from having, under 50 or 100 deaths a year across the entire border to, in some years, over 300 deaths in Arizona alone. So prevention through deterrence has led to the deaths of thousands of people. In Arizona right now, there's a little over 3,200 documented cases of people dying in Arizona, and the forensic work suggests that number is significantly undercounts the number of people who actually die and who are never recovered. So Hostile Terrain 94 is designed to raise awareness about this issue that many people don't know about, and to do that, what we have done, and we've just recently had our virtual opening in Santa Fe, which you can see online and hopefully see in person very soon, is we've tried to organize with different communities around the globe to construct giant wall maps of the Arizona desert and fill out the 3,200 toe tags with all of the death information for those who have died, and then mount those tags onto a wall that puts those toe tags in the exact location of where those individuals died. The idea is that by asking volunteers to commit, 20 minutes of their time filling out some toe tags and participating in this exhibition, that they will be more connected to one individual who has lost their life, and perhaps learn and engage with this issue in a different kind of way than one would by just reading a newspaper article or watching a documentary film. So it's completely participatory and incredibly collaborative. We are expecting to launch over 130 exhibitions on 6 continents, starting hopefully by the end of the year and going into the fall of 2021. All of those exhibition hosts will be organizing thousands of people in their communities to fill out toe tags, to construct these wall maps, and also to generate other types of programming. So we are asking our partners to find ways to connect this exhibition to local issues that are affecting them. And so to give you an example, our first European show is slated to happen on the island of Lampedusa in Italy, in the Mediterranean, where we are anticipating working with refugees who are currently being detained there to fill out toe tags and to construct these maps, but then also to tell their own stories about their migration experiences in a way to draw connections with what's happening in places like Latin America. And so we'll be doing this all over the globe. If you are interested in this, please check out our websites. HostileTerrain94.org is where you can go to learn about the exhibition. The Undocumented Migration Project, undocumentedmigrationproject.org is a place where you can learn about the overall scope of our work. And then finally, I just wanted to end with a current project that we're doing during this pandemic. We are trying to find ways to stay engaged with our communities And so we've all obviously gone virtual as a way to stay connected. And our current project right now, as we're getting ready for a series of fall virtual webinars, documentary film screenings, and other kinds of events, in preparation for those things, we are seeking 3,200 volunteers from around the world to record 30-second videos of themselves reading out the names and information for one person who has died. We will collate this into a video that will be potentially 15 hours long of just people reading off names, and then those videos will be incorporated into our physical exhibitions as well as into our virtual programming. So if you're interested, we would love for you to get involved in this project. We need your help. We've just surpassed the 1,000 person mark, so we still have about 2,200 more volunteers that we need. So I'm going to show a quick little video here, giving you an example of what the virtual moment of global remembrance looks like, and then I will pass the baton to my friend and colleague Ieva. So if we could start that video, that'd be great.
Name, unidentified. Age, unknown. Reporting date, September 5th, 2010. Cause of death, undetermined.
Alfonso Salas Villagrán, edad 64 años, fecha del informe 22 de agosto de 2006, causa de la muerte cardiopatía.
Name David Orocho Romo, Alter 20, Meldedatum 28. September 2004, Todesursache Verletzung durch stumpfe Gewalt.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ieva Jusionyte. I am an anthropologist and currently associate professor at Harvard University. And my work examines statecraft and violence, the latest project focusing on emergency responders. So I took their pragmatic perspective to try to understand the effects of border militarization on human life. Between 2015 and 2017, I conducted ethnographic research on both sides of the US-Mexico border in fire departments. Being an emergency responder myself, I also volunteered in a fire department on the Arizona side and at the Migrant Aid Center on the Sonora side. In this region, most fire departments are also providing ambulance services, so firefighters are trained as EMTs or emergency medical technicians or paramedics. And being an emergency responder, coming to this project, I already knew, I was aware of the unusual position that we occupy in American society as both agents of the state or employees of the government or volunteers sometimes of government organizations who are tasked with attending to people wounded directly or indirectly by a variety of governmental policies and practices. So when I began research, the system of barriers along the border stretched for over 650 miles, or covering roughly 1/3 of the entire US Southwest border, and it is not much longer now. So most of the new construction has been just reinforcements or replacements of older fences. The wall is a key component of what Customs and Border Protection calls tactical infrastructure, and this is a concept that they use to refer to an assemblage of materials and technologies that regulate movement in the name of national security. As we know, due to criminalization of immigration, as well as concerns with terrorism after 9/11, the US government has designated the border with Mexico as a source of threats, and crossing it has become more difficult and more dangerous. We don't really know the number of people who have died, but it's in the thousands, and Hostile Terrain 94 project is trying to make more people aware of the scale of this tragedy, But even more people have been injured. So when the new bollard-style barriers came up in southern towns in Arizona, emergency responders began going to see people with leg and ankle injuries so frequently that they began referring to the cement ledge abutting the border wall as Ankle Alley. Besides leg and ankle fractures, there was also a lot of multi-system trauma involving spinal cord injuries and head injuries that can result in death. So the injuries depended on the design of the border wall. The previous barrier, which was made of these metal sheets used as landing pads for aircraft during the Vietnam War, was not as tall, but it had very sharp edges on top, and people frequently had their fingers amputated or got lashes and lacerations to their bodies. In my work, I argue that these border wounds do not work the same way as injuries linked to other histories or geographies of violence. So when trauma happens abroad, especially in countries with regimes that have a dubious human rights record, scars of torture and other bodily imprints of force become evidence of victimhood and vulnerability, which entitle individuals to seek asylum. But border wounds, whether it is a leg fracture or a kidney failure, which is something that people experience due to severe dehydration when they cross the border through the desert, rather than making the injured qualified for asylum and for care and protection, these injuries are being read as proof of crime, as evidence of entering the country without authorization, which has led to the blending of medical services on the border and border policing. And what that means is that often injured border crossers are taken into custody by the Border Patrol as a precondition of being transported to the hospital. But in my work, I also found that migrants are not the only victims of border militarization. Tactical infrastructure also harms binational communities that straddle the boundary. A lot of emergencies, from wildfires to flash floods to toxic spills, spread from one country to another without regard for national jurisdictions. And aware of this intertwinement, emergency services have developed binational partnerships, some of which date more than a century or longer than the border fence has existed. And today, sister cities such as Ambos, Nogales, where I worked, have mutual aid agreements on the municipal level that allow them to share resources and personnel, and during fires, shuttle water back and forth, or even pass hoses through the gaps in the fence to help people on the other side. So examining border issues from the perspective of emergency responders through the lens of injury and rescue allows us to understand the contradictions of the state, which both wounds and cares, or which engages in extra-legal punishment for trespass. It injures border crossers, but follows it up with a legally mandated provision of aid, so it sends ambulances. I have not been able to travel to Nogales since the onset of the pandemic in March. However, I have been in regular contact with emergency responders on both sides of the border since March, as they were preparing for what they knew is coming their way. So they were making sure they have enough PPE. Since then, some of them, again, on both sides of the border have already been diagnosed with COVID-19. Back in March, the Trump administration closed the border to all non-essential travel between the US and Mexico, but it had some exceptions. So people who are traveling for work and for study were exempt, as well as emergency responders were exempt. So they could still freely travel to one side or the other to work on binational emergencies. However, aid groups, so a lot of these humanitarian organizations that are providing food and shelter and legal and medical aid to migrants stranded in Mexico who are awaiting their asylum hearings in the US, which have now been postponed indefinitely, a lot of these volunteers have stopped coming because their travel was deemed non-essential. So that's one big development that has happened, and these asylum seekers have very limited access to medical health services on the Mexican side. In general, in Mexico, the public healthcare system is quite under-equipped, and some of the first people who got sick with the coronavirus were doctors and nurses who were working in public hospitals. The preparations began knowing that the virus would most likely come to Mexico from the United States, and the border doesn't stop air or water, it doesn't stop drugs or guns or people, and it certainly doesn't stop viruses. So there were early on the Mexican side of the border, people in Nogales staged protests, closing the southbound lanes at the port of entry, trying to tell local Sonoran government to maybe stop more American travelers from coming southbound. And one of the things that the Mexican government did is install these sanitation corridors that spray people with chemicals when they enter Mexico, which really doesn't do much for public health purposes. The public health sector, the hospitals have been quite overwhelmed, but a lot of people don't even go there. They work in the informal economy. They worked in the maquiladoras that were very slow to close down. So really the economic concerns overlapped with public health concerns, and the situation in Mexico is not good. It's very hard to compare to the United States, although I would say it's probably very similar. There is much less testing going on there, but if you follow the information from the Johns Hopkins University, as for incidence rate, there is about 2,500 people per 100,000 people infected in Arizona, and only 619 in Sonora, so it's 4 times less, but again, the testing is probably not as extensive. And to just sum up this introduction, I would like to say that from my experience in the border and my research shows that communities that are so intricately tied in the everyday life, that share emergency resources and public utilities and infrastructures, that they would do better addressing the threat, a virus that obeys no political jurisdictions, working together. And we should not, going forward, we must make sure that the border is not closed, because it only gives a false sense of safety in a binational town where life and health on one side depends on what is happening on the other side. Thank you.
Hi, my name is CJ Alvarez. I teach in the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Texas. And I wrote this book, Borderland, Border Water. It's a history book. I'm a historian, one of the rare historians that come through SAR. It's mostly anthropologists, as you all know. So most of my documents came from archives, not ethnographies, which has made it a bit easier for me to carry on my work throughout the pandemic. But I want to tell you over the next few minutes a little bit about this book to orient you with where I'm coming from in the context of border studies. But first of all, I want to lay out 3 assumptions that people often make about the border that I tried to resist in various ways as I researched and wrote the book. The first is what I've found through straw polls and just through what I know, giving talks and teaching about the border for a number of years, is that the vast majority of people in both the United States and in Mexico have never actually been to the border. And yet it is this enormously outsized issue in both countries politically. Those people who have been to the border have typically only are familiar with 1, maybe 2 border towns or along the entire 2,000-mile international divide. I think it's also the case that a lot of the time when we talk about the border in the broader political and social discourse in the United States, we're not actually talking about the border. We're talking about the history of immigration policy and enforcement, and we're using the border as a proxy to have that conversation. And I think that oftentimes when the border is discussed, the narrative tends to fall into one of 2 kinds of pathological discourses. And what I mean by that is there's a more right-wing version of the border that casts it as a pathological place. And this is the narrative that says the border needs to be fortified, it needs to be militarized, it needs to be heavily policed in order to keep bad elements and bad things out of the United States from infecting and from disturbing our social fabric. The left-wing pathological narrative of the border tends to focus on humanitarian disasters and terrible abuses and all the really kind of awful forms of exploitation and I think largely unnecessary punishment that takes place through policing on the international divide. What I try to do in my work is take that problem of unfamiliarity, this unfamiliar place that most people only know through the news or through this sort of broader, I hesitate to call it a debate, but this broader conversation about the border in the US. And I try to make that unfamiliar landscape familiar by going into a great deal of detail about as many specific places along the international divide as I possibly could. Similarly, I try to detach the border history that I write from an immigration focused kind of book by, again, fleshing out the specificities of different border places and trying to explain to the reader how the kinds of dynamics of enforcement and border policy actually play out very differently on different parts of the international divide. And finally, I try to tell a more ambiguous story than is often found in the pathological narratives of the border. It's a story that is harder to pin down as right or wrong, as right or left. And again, I try to do that through the nuance that I bring to the built environment of the border, which I'll talk about in a second. So one of the most common responses, the most common response that I've gotten as I wrote the book and and after I published the book is people say, wow, what a relevant topic, the history of the US-Mexico border. And I know where they're coming from. It's this, kind of, but what's implied that I find a bit difficult to navigate oftentimes. Somehow I got the impetus for writing this book from the news cycle, from the developments of the past few years, and nothing could be further from the case. I see a lot of graduate students today and a lot of folks in general kind of gravitating to border topics because of a particular kind of policy that they really despise and they find morally repugnant. And I find myself in complete agreement with the vast majority of the criticisms of the way the built environment of policing and the tactics of policing have unfolded. But I wrote this book because I love the border. I love the border region. I love the environments, this multiplicity of environments that the international divide passes through. And I love border people. I myself am actually the fourth generation from Las Cruces, New Mexico. And so for us, the border has been relevant since the 1850s, when my family first came from Mexico across to the U.S. side, first to El Paso and then to southern New Mexico. And so, yes, I wrote the book because I think it's relevant, but I wrote it from the point of view of a deep historical relevance, and that's what drove me to write this book. The story I tell is quite simple. There was a time in the 1840s when the international divide was first established after the Mexican American War, when there was really nothing built there at all. There were very few signs that there even was a border there. And I tell a history of accretion about how the border went from a place where virtually nothing was built to this overbuilt environment that we find today. And so I look at and I describe the construction and the accretion of everything from survey markers to railroads to military patrol roads during the Mexican Revolution, early barbed wire ranch fencing on the border, watchtowers, diversion dams, storage dams, and how that completely transformed populations around the river border, river straightening initiatives, instances where they actually moved the river entirely, the canalization of the river, the concrete lining of the river, and eventually highways and highway spurs that led to a whole proliferation of new ports of entry in the NAFTA years. And of course, the big fencing mega projects that we saw in the late 2000s. So the way I look at this history is kind of like a mathematical equation. I approached it by asking, what is the connection between the natural world, that is rivers, deserts, mountains, the built environment, all those things I just mentioned before, all these structures that have gathered on the US-Mexico divide, and political developments, the context of policymaking in both Mexico and the United States that gave rise to certain building projects at certain times in certain places, but not others. So this equation of natural environment, built environment, and political developments is the framework I use to ask the research questions and then to devise the book. So let me show you what I mean by that. This map is a map I had made for the book that includes every single place name that I mentioned throughout the entire monograph. So this to me is what the border looks like. And this to me is one of the most, explains the most about the border. And what you can see here is the natural environment, the rivers, the deserts. Here's the Sonoran Desert that of course Jason knows very well. The Chihuahuan Desert, the big storage dams on the international divide, of course all the different towns, states, and then of course the railroads, and so on and so forth. So what you can see here, and every single one of these place names, whether it's a small mountain range like these right here, whether it's a small town like Columbus right here, or whether it's an entire ecoregion like the Chihuahuan Desert here, has a story about it that fits into this larger narrative about the border that I explain in the context of the book. So some of the surprises, I think the biggest surprise that I encountered when I went into the archives and devised this strategy for how to tell this border history was the extent of water engineering, and the extent to which, and we often forget this, that the US-Mexico border is predominantly a water border. A little bit of the Colorado River, but the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo in Mexico, makes up the majority of the international divide. And the extent to which that waterway, which doubles as a border, has been transformed through human intervention, through the built environment, is astonishing. We have this way of thinking about, well, okay, if you're going to write about the construction on the US-Mexico border, if you're going to write about the built environment on the US-Mexico border, you must be writing about the big fencing projects. And certainly those are in the book. But if the question is tweaked a little bit and you ask, what, where, and how have human interventions in the natural world been expressed in the most totalizing and maximalist way, what you find is the water border has been more thoroughly manipulated and more thoroughly altered than the land border has, even if you count the Secure Fence Act construction that we all know too well at this point. So one of the main contentions of the book is that there's a difference between border land and border water, based on the fact that there are different kinds of construction projects, different kinds of building projects that you find building up on both of those, in both of those spaces. But a corollary contention of the book is that they actually have more in common than you might think, where immigration police and policymakers interested in policing and regulating what happened, what crossed the international divide, looked to building projects to accomplish that. Water engineers also looked to building projects to control aspects of nature, to control flooding, to control irrigation, to control the wildness of a largely desert river that doubles as the international divide. And so I wanted to write this book to highlight both the differences between land construction and hydraulic engineering, but also to draw these connections that a lot of people hadn't noticed before about the extent to which the social engineering of the police infrastructure on the border is actually surprisingly tied to the environmental engineering of the river border. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Greetings, my name is Debbie Baim. I'm a professor of anthropology and gender, race, and identity at the University of Nevada, Reno. This year I've been in residency full-time at Freedom for Immigrants, which is an organization that supports people in detention while working to abolish immigrant prisons in the United States. And in 2013, while I was a visiting scholar at SAR, I was finishing a book about deportation, and the research that I'm going to talk about today directly came out of the project. So I'm especially grateful for that support and for the opportunity to be part of this event. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can show you some of the photographs from my field work. The project that I've been working on is titled A Study of Unseen Spaces. It's ongoing longitudinal ethnographic work. It's a research project about the confinement of immigrants in detention and the invisibility of this unjust system. And this is the entryway to a detention facility in South Texas. And it's also the study of the movement to abolish immigration detention. As you might know, the United States has the largest immigration detention system in the world. This is a map that Freedom for Immigrants has on its website, an interactive map. And it shows you detention facilities in real time around the country. As recently as the 1980s, the US incarcerated about 30 people a day for immigration reasons. But those rates have been climbing since then, regardless of the presidential administration, regardless of the political party that's in power, to a high of nearly 60,000 people who have been imprisoned on any given day under the current administration. The field sites where I've been working include different spaces of confinement. So I have been working in federal detention centers that you probably imagine when you think about this system. This is a privately run facility in Eloy, Arizona. But I've also been working in county jails, immigration courtrooms, in ICE offices when people go for check-ins, and also I've been working with people who are required to wear ankle monitor surveillance. So I'm trying in the project to expand the way that we think about detention itself. And then in addition to working in spaces of detention, I'm also working in the spaces and communities around detention, such as shelters and hospitality houses. This is a shelter that was in operation for a period of time in Tucson, Arizona, that was receiving hundreds of people a night who had been released from Border Patrol custody. I've also been working in family homes with many different community organizations, transportation hubs, as people are being released from detention and going to elsewhere in the country. My methodologies are ethnographic, interviews, oral histories. I have been conducting participant observation, but most significantly, I've been doing participatory research with people directly impacted by detention and those in solidarity with them. And this is a letter from someone who was in detention to one of the volunteers I've been working with. And she actually has boxes of letters that she's received in her garage. And we're in the process of creating an exhibit that will be part of UNR's participation in Hostile Terrain 94. So that's an example of the kind of projects that I've been doing that are participatory. And then also, as I mentioned, I've been working with Freedom for Immigrants very closely, and this has been a significant component of my research. To give you an overview of the project, a large part of the project has focused on the injustice that is bred in these multiple unseen spaces of detention. The system is opaque, it's difficult to penetrate. In large part, this is precisely how the system operates. It's through this inaccessibility and invisibility. And to give you some examples of that, here's another detention center in Texas. As you can see, it's difficult to even view it on the horizon. These are places that it can be very difficult to get to, that can be difficult to enter. There may be no opportunity to enter facilities or visit people in person. To give you an example, in my home community, there's a county jail with ICE detention, but they only allow video visitation. So even if family travels from long distances, they cannot meet with their loved one face to face. People often disappear in detention. They're unable to be located by their families and their attorneys. And these unseen spaces become brutal spaces where people face significant abuses. These can include inadequate nutrition, noncompliance with religious diets, medical neglect, sometimes very serious medical neglect, sexual assault, physical harm. People are transferred far from family, again, without any communication to those family members. So this is a way that the process, by being unseen, they also are translated into very violent spaces. In addition, I've also been focusing on actions to counter and end detention. It's a very diverse movement, but there is a powerful collective movement that is working to dismantle this system. So despite the harsh conditions of detention, there are very close relationships that develop that connect people inside and outside through visitation, phone calls, letters, as I mentioned. This is, again, the Freedom for Immigrants map, but this time with the visitation programs that are affiliated with the organization throughout the country. They're represented by the hearts. And there also is a deep commitment to shutting down individual facilities and abolishing the system as a whole. This is from Stewart Detention Center is in Lumpkin, Georgia. It's one of the country's largest immigrant prisons, notorious for abuses that have happened there. And this is the West County Jail in Richmond, California. This is actually at a monthly protest that was happening leading up to 2018 when the sheriff ended his contract with ICE, and in large part credited the community activists who were regularly protesting there with why he ended that. This is similarly another still existing ICE detention facility. This is the Yuba County Jail in Marysville, California. But this was a protest that happened in January of this year that was organized by Suru for Solidarity, which is a group of survivors of the incarceration camps during World War II. So these efforts, in some places they have successfully closed down facilities, and in other places the work is ongoing. I also wanted to talk a bit about how the pandemic has impacted my research. And I think on the one hand, COVID has brought into relief the horrors of incarceration in its many forms. This is a still shot from a video that men inside Mesa Verde Detention Center, which is in California, they made this video to protest the grave risk of COVID that they face inside, and also in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. So on the one hand, again, COVID has brought into relief the horrors of incarceration. But on the other hand, the pandemic has shown us that abolition is possible. People have been released through humanitarian parole, and as a result of several class action suits, ICE is now reporting that they have a daily average. These figures are not always accurate, but they're now reporting that they have a daily average of about 22,000 people in detention. And again, that's down from a high of nearly 60,000 on any given day in recent years. So this shows the public in a concrete way that there is no reason to imprison people while they are waiting for immigration proceedings. And in conclusion, as I've reflected on SAR's Beyond Borders series, I've been thinking about how the study of immigration detention provides insights about the character of borders and borderlands. The US immigration detention system reveals how the US-Mexico border and our borders more generally are extending north and south and into the country's interior. This is, an example is that people are detained in places like Lumpkin, Georgia, that I mentioned, or they might be detained in Portland, Oregon. This is a facility in downtown Portland, Oregon that many people don't even realize is an ICE facility in their own community. And actually in 2018, an Occupy movement effectively shut this facility down for a period of time, although it was later reopened. But this gives you a sense of how the borders are extending into the interior of our country. And similarly, the US detention system is extending south, north, and globally. This is a shot from a queue with the Remain in Mexico program, which is euphemistically called the Migrant Protection Protocols. This is taken in Mexico. And essentially, this is the exportation of US detention to Mexico. The MPP program, the Migrant Protection Protocols, there are estimates of close to 60,000 people who are waiting to have their asylum case considered, or to even be allowed to enter the country to have their asylum case be considered. So this gives you a sense of just how extensive this kind of exportation of detention is in the case of the US. So there's significant work to be done close to home and around the globe. And I want to close with a point about the creativity and endurance of people impacted by detention that I've seen throughout my research, whether it's by linking incarceration camps in the past to today's system of immigration detention, as Suru for Solidarity is doing, or activism that shuts down one facility at a time, or protests that are happening in this time of COVID, both inside and outside of detention. there's a really powerful movement focused on abolishing immigration detention that is ongoing. And I encourage you to learn more and hopefully get involved in efforts to dismantle this system of deep injustice.
Thanks to our presenters. They'll join me in a minute. Before they do, or while they're joining, I want to mention that if you have a question, you should type it into the chat box, which is used depending on which device you're using on the side of it's a control panel on the right side of your screen, and we'll try and process them as quickly as we can. And also that we'll be circulating, or we'll be uploading a poll to ask you to take a few minutes just to talk about this event and other events that SAR has run. So Jason and I will be handling questions, or that is addressing our panelists with questions. Let me lead with one that Deborah's talk mentions. Do you think that that migrants are better off on the Mexican side of the border waiting for admission to the United States, or under essentially terms of incarceration on the US side of the border, especially given the COVID situation? What's your understanding of that?
I think that's a really important question, and one that when you're talking about inhumane conditions in different contexts, I think it's hard to say that one is preferable to the other. The conditions in the camps along this the border on the Mexico side are equally horrific, and in many ways. So I think that I think it's kind of a difficult question to answer, in the sense that, you know, here we have a system that, again, close to over 100,000 people are being essentially detained or de facto detained as you move across the border. But I think, you know, and especially with COVID in the current moment, we also are seeing all kinds of risks that people are facing. The violence that's south of the border is very difficult for people to, you know, there are people who are displaced going all over the country. There are people from all over the world south of the border who are waiting to enter the country. So, and they obviously are unable to go back to places of origin. So I think that, yeah, it's a difficult question, but one that I think neither option is humane and just. And I think that actually having people in their communities, whether it's in their communities with their families here in the US, with communities from their nation of origin here in the US, this is the best option for people who are waiting for their immigration proceedings, and one that we can easily do, as we've seen in recent months.
Here's a follow-up to that question. Anybody can jump in here, but you probably saw there was a PBS News, a couple of segments about people coming out through Darien, a lot of Africans who sort of land in Colombia and then move up to Panama, and then from Panama to the US border. Is the Mexican American border actually equipped to deal with people from, you know, West Africa or Haiti or Syria and so on, who are among those that were featured in the news report? Are they dealt with differently than Spanish-speaking Central American migrants?
Oh yeah, Jason, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, Debbie, please.
Well, I was going to say that, yeah, there are people from all over the world, especially in these camps, and both Jason and Ieva probably have been doing work with people in the current moment more extensively maybe than I have. But I agree with you that the specifics of that we're creating a situation, and I think that this is really an extension of our detention system. I think that we can argue that what is happening along the border, even though it's in Mexico, is a very important part of our system. And so, yes, Mexico is not in a position they simply don't have the resources to manage that level of crisis, and it's our making as a nation.
You know, I think one thing for our audience to think about is, you know, many of the things that are happening under this current administration were already in place under Obama. and we've just either just continued them or augmented them or expanded them. Starting in 2014, during the first kind of big wave of Central American kids coming up through South Texas, Obama and Mexico come up with what was called Plan Frontera Sur, which was an attempt to basically slow all these migrants down in Mexico under the thinking, superficially saying that they were there to be protected and to bring some control to this movement of people, but in fact it was just really a new kind of detainment and deportation project, fully supported in a lot of ways by the U.S. And so, we can start to think about Mexico as this other border wall, and as well as Honduras. I mean, we've got Border Patrol agents, U.S. agents in Honduras and other parts of Central America who are training those governments to catch people or to keep them from leaving, both like Honduran nationals from leaving their own country, as well as people who are coming up from South America as well. And, I would say too that like the routes across Mexico, in response to your question about different treatments, the routes across Mexico have become very racialized, and also fall along kind of national boundaries or national lines. I mean, you will find more, Cameroonians in Tijuana than you will in, say, Juarez. People coming from Honduras, Afro-Hondurans tend to go up through South Texas because they're trying to get to Houston or New Orleans or New York. White mestizo Hondurans are trying to get to places like California, so they're coming up on the western coast. So even within Mexico, there's a lot of this kind of racialization or nationalization of these migration routes. But I wanted to ask a question to panelists. All of you are doing such important work on these issues that I think are so invisible to the general public. I mean, when people talk about immigration, they're not talking about the binational communities. They're not talking about oftentimes the detention center in their backyard that they don't know about. They're not talking about the natural environment and the ways in which border walls and geopolitical security initiatives have devastated natural environments, have radically changed that landscape. And this is a question that I don't like getting asked, so I'll ask all of you because I think it's a good time to ask this sort of question. I think given that we're just in the middle of a DNC and we're kind of ramping up for this this election, I was wondering if I could just ask each of you to maybe give our audience sort of, if we were to put you on an immigration reform panel and say, what is one kind of key aspect, and particularly one that we don't think about from your own research that people should be aware of, that politicians who are working towards immigration reform, what's something that they're not thinking about that you think they really should be sort of incorporating into these conversations?
I really understand why you don't like being asked that question. So, and I think this is something that emerged from the presentations that you heard today, is how detached the actual reality on the border, or even the reality regarding the immigration system, is from people's understanding of what is going on. So, of course, there is no one quick solution to the problem. Like, it didn't start in recent years. As you mentioned, a lot of our immigration policies and border enforcement policies started much earlier, and they will continue probably for a while, but that doesn't mean that we can't make small adjustments, or at least stop the practices that are most deadly and most injurious to the people. And at least from like my research side and my perspective, one of them is really forgetting what's going on in these binational communities. And these are not really necessarily small towns. I did most of my research in Ambos Nogales, or some of it in Douglas, Agua Prieta, but some of these are big communities, like the San Diego, Tijuana area, Ciudad Juarez, and El Paso. And these communities really depend on different cross-border movements, exchanges, help. People commute for work, for school, for medical appointments. So connecting their lived reality to the question of the immigration reform, I think, is a little bit unfair and makes for some decisions that hurts people who live on both sides of the border. This doesn't answer the part about what to do with the immigration system, which clearly needs an overhaul, but at least that's like my little 2 cents from where I work.
No one else wants to jump in on this one?
Well, so one of the benefits of being a historian is it gives me a way to dodge policy questions by kind of bringing it back into the past. And so this is my dodge, but my roundabout way of answering your question, Jason, which obviously I think is a really good one and an important one. I would point out 2 things historically. One is that, and I've traced the history of fencing, like large-scale fencing, going back to the 1930s and 40s when they first started building like big ranch fences and some pedestrian fences. And one of the things I found is that the biggest difference between previous fencing initiatives on the border, going really all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, and then recent, and by recent I mean post-2000 fencing initiatives, is not so much they used to be small and now they're big, although that's really important, but they used to be devised by local sections of not just the Border Patrol, but also animal industry inspectors and that sort of thing. And so it is precisely the fact politicians, most of whom are not from the border, even border states, are devising border policy that I think is part of the problem. And I would also point out a little known fact, and that is when you look at the water engineering projects, which are the majority of building projects on the border, you find that those are all, by definition, bilaterally cooperative projects, half Mexican engineers, half American engineers. Everything's bilingual, by law. And largely speaking, those have been relatively successful examples of bilateral cooperation that people tend to forget about. What do you think, Debbie?
Yeah, I think actually it's interesting when you think about something like abolishing our immigration detention system. I think people might think of that as an ideological, inaccessible kind of change, but I actually think it's the opposite. I think that abolition is the most practical policy path for us as a nation. And I mentioned that, as recently as the 1980s, we essentially didn't have an immigration detention system in this country. So the fact that it has been built means that we can take it away, right? We can deconstruct it. And, there are a lot of factors that went into that, and most of them are linked to profit and the private corporations that run these particular prison systems, but we can dismantle it in a very practical way, right? People can immigration detention is civil detention. There's no reason that we need to have that in place. We don't need to have any kind of detention in place. I guess the conversation about mass incarceration more generally is also something that I think is very important to link to this. But policymakers, especially at the federal level, are often focused on reform. How can we make these prisons safer? How can we provide better medical care? And I think that when you have a system of injustice that is this deep, those are not going to be the practical policy steps. But in fact, the practical policy step would be abolish it.
I've got a related question. Amy asked, I really appreciate the insights that you brought us. What concrete things can I do to affect change? Nobody wants to venture into this territory.
So many things. Depends on what, there is a lot of need for people who help with asylum cases. So if somebody is interested in law, you can volunteer to help with asylum cases. You can become a medical volunteer and go to the borderlands. you can participate in political campaigning, I suppose, and different ballot initiatives. For example, in Arizona, there was a ballot initiative for universal representation, so that migrants would be represented in court. There's just so much to be done. I don't know where to start.
Mm-hmm. You know, I tell my students who, you know, come to me and they say, I want to go to the Sonora Desert and I want to help migrants. And I say, well, you know, there's a lot of migrants in your community that need just as much help, and you don't have to, you know, going for 1 week to the desert, you know, is that better than spending 6 months volunteering with an organization, you know, or longer in your community? And so I think there are ways to directly connect with people and with these groups and these organizations, these nonprofits. I mean, they all need help, and you know, and it's not, I think, you know, if people are just enthusiastic, they'll find ways to get people involved. I mean, you don't necessarily have to speak Spanish. You know, they can utilize other skills that people kind of bring to the table. But I think, you know, I tell students, like, just find out what's going on locally and try to get really involved and see where that takes you. But I would also say, you know, obviously voting, you know, both locally and nationally is important. But I think, you know, maybe what's even as powerful, or maybe even better in the long term, is to get educated beyond just what's in the news cycle, to really try to take a deep dive into one of these issues, so that you know, when you have conversations with someone, you're not just reciting something you read in the New York Times, but you have a deeper understanding of it. And I think in a lot of cases, we really need historical understanding of these issues, because, you know, we blame this current administration for all these issues, and it's like, man, well, these things have been happening for a long time. And I think knowing that can be a really powerful thing, both to just to become educated, but also to kind of educate others. Because I feel like when I listen in on conversations, or when I avoid, you know, the Thanksgiving, like, oh God, don't bring up immigration at Thanksgiving with certain family members, like, because they just read some article about this thing and then they want to talk about it. And I think that if you can talk to people about the kind of deeper history of the stuff, it makes for more interesting conversations. And it's not this kind of back and forth of just like, this is what's in the news cycle, but really it's like, you know, I've tried to take a deeper dive, and you know, this is what I've learned. I think that can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, and if I could just put in a plug for Freedom for Immigrants and other organizations that are working around these issues. I think, as Jason's pointing out, you can get involved at the local level. That's a really important way to do this, and follow the lead of organizations that have been doing this work. You know, you don't have to you don't have to save the world. There are already folks out there doing the hard work. And so I think also supporting that work by funding it, and being donors to different organizations around issues that are important to you. I think that those are ways that, you know, you can volunteer your time. Obviously, you can volunteer whatever kinds of skills you have. I mean, I know, like, again, in Freedom for Immigrants, there are people working on policy. There are people from all over the world who speak different languages who work the hotline. So there's all different kinds of ways you can kind of match your interests and what's important and you're passionate about with working for change.
We've got a great question from John Yeda Phillips, who's on the SAR board, and he's joining us from Bloomington, Indiana. He says, excellent panel and presentations. Thank you all. I'm intrigued by Jason's connections to contexts far from the US-Mexico border. What contrasts and lessons might be drawn between the US and, say, Mediterranean context for asylum seekers? Or put another way, what might US residents learn from these distant contexts to help reframe conversations about the US-Mexican border, human rights, and notions of national sovereignty? It's a big question, a tough one.
You know, I'll just say that for us, drawing those connections and those parallels is crucial to get the American public to not think about immigration as a US-Mexico border issue. Because I think when we think about it so myopically, that our problems can all be solved by a border wall, fails to recognize that we are in the midst of a global migration crisis, and things that are happening, you know, in the dry zone of Central America, because of climate change, are going to impact things that are happening at the U.S.-Mexico border, things that are happening in the Midwest, and all of those connections. I mean, we are, as we start to really feel the effects of human-induced climate change, we're going to have more and more people from different places moving and trying to find a livable situation. And so for us, like the Mediterranean, it's not. You can see I want everyone to see this whole thing as all deeply interconnected. And so if you understanding about what's happening in the Mediterranean, I think can help people understand what's happening in Latin America, because it's all part of the same process, and it's only going to get worse, and it's only going to ramp up. And if we can get to a point where we can see all these connections and how these things are related, maybe we'll start to believe that a simplistic idea like constructing a wall is going to somehow save us from this. So I think for that's part of just getting educated, is if you can understand this as a global phenomenon, then maybe you'll start to be more supportive of global solutions.
Anyone else?
Borders really become violent when there is asymmetry. There is a lot of it. Our world is asymmetrical in terms of power that stems back from history. So we have colonial histories both here in this hemisphere, but also in what Europe is dealing with. And these borders become so fortified, whether it is a water or whether it is a desert, because people are trying to leave places where they cannot no longer live, but also because this is how the global capitalism works, creating these inequalities, making some people as well as goods movable around, and then making other people stuck somewhere so they can be exploited. So understanding these connections between what's going on here and elsewhere, I agree with Jason, would help us see that this is not a United States problem or not a US-Mexico problem.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, I think that's so important. I also am thinking of like CJ's work that, we need to extend our analysis to look at the context across space and also across time. I think both of those can be really helpful tools.
Speaking of CJ, there's a question from Alina, which is, thank you for sharing your work. My question is for CJ. Can you tell us a little bit about the sources you consulted? I'm wondering how the borderland's different actors have historically written about the border and how conflicting or converging interests have shaped the border. Big question.
Yeah, I'll give you a tiny answer, just in the interest of time. But the quick answer is I use two kinds of sources. I use the files of the International Boundary Commission in both the United States and Mexico, which is like the diplomatic arm that actually builds stuff on the US-Mexico border. And so that helped me reconstruct, like in very great detail, the actual construction projects and where they were and the local context, to try to breathe life into a history of building and infrastructure, which is not the easiest thing to, kind of make vivacious. I used a lot of oral histories, most of which are totally accessible to anyone who wants them, word searchable at the Institute of Oral History at University of Texas, El Paso, at UTEP. And it's an absolute goldmine to get a sense in both English and Spanish of just how people experienced the changing built environment around them on the border.
There's a question here from Sarah. Detention has become a big business, not only for private prison companies, but also corporations that provide ancillary assistance to the prison detention business, such as Amazon. I don't know any of the details there, but I assume there's a backstory. How can we dismantle the system with states such as New Mexico receiving millions from the federal government and see this federal money flowing into the state as economic development for rural counties? There's a tough one.
Yeah, that's a good question, and a difficult one. But again, I think that what we need to do is look at where these profits are going. I think there is this narrative of they're serving the communities, but I can tell you that the communities that I've been to where these large private prisons are located are not thriving economically, right? that sort of development is not going to the communities in the ways that the narrative presents itself. So I actually think that what that's doing is just further profiting the businesses that are behind it, rather than the communities. This has happened here in Nevada, in Nye County, in Pahrump, Nevada, a very out of the way place. They just started a large contract with ICE, and it was all under this supposed benefit that was going to come to the community. And I can tell you that that has not unfolded. So.
Okay, we're sort of getting to the end of our allotted time here. Let me end with an interesting question from Alexander, who thanks you for the panel. He says, I'm curious about thematic differences and differences of emphasis that might exist between US-related scholarship about the border and Mexico-based scholarship about the border. I don't know, CJ, do you want to take that one? Does anybody else want to jump in?
I'd love to jump in for that one. You know, this is to me a fascinating question. It's largely the subject of my second book, which is about the Chihuahuan Desert, which is mostly on the Mexican side. And it's my attempt to actually talk about the border from not in the context of U.S. policy as it plays out on the southern border, but in the context of the Mexican North, which in Mexican history and Mexican historiography is this very identifiable region that has a lot in common with the American West and how we think about the American West in terms of development, in terms of industry, in terms of and in terms of the environment. And so, you know, to me, that's, I think, one of the hugely productive kinds of potential that we have in the future is to actually collaborate more and build up border scholarship with our colleagues on the Mexican side. And even though the historiographic traditions are not really mirror images of one another.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have anything to say on that theme?
I'll just add that, you know, we're going to increasingly have to be aware of how Mexico is thinking about its southern border, and the real striking parallels between the development of anti-immigrant sentiment towards Central Americans and others in Mexico, as well as, you know, the growing detention industrial complex that's happening in Mexico too. I mean, it really is starting to look like southern Chiapas is starting to look like southern Arizona in a lot of ways, with temporary checkpoints, detention centers, an increase in federal agents who are, you know, apprehending people, the corruption that comes with rapid growth of some of these industries. So I think that we're going to start having to look at that too, and how, you know, the researchers in Mexico who are working on these human rights issues are starting to really see a lot of these parallels with the issues that we've been dealing with. And so I think there's a big space for us to have more conversations with those colleagues.
And I think actually just to jump in along those same lines, you know, I very rarely use the term militarization to talk about the buildup on the U.S. side of the border, precisely because. Not because I don't think that civil policing has reached an obscene outcome, but because the border on the Mexican side is fully militarized and has been since the Fox deployments in the early, you know, stages of the most recent drug war. And by that I mean the Mexican army, relatively unfettered, in a combat formation with Mexican citizens, which of course is part and parcel of a much larger dynamic of the drug war that's hemispheric and U.S. led. And so I think that it behooves us all to be as precise as we can about which side of the border we're talking about, and the extent to which a lot of these same terms can be usefully compared and contrasted on both sides.
Well, let me thank our presenters, Jason, Ieva, Deborah, and CJ. And I'd also like to thank our partners in this project and SAR staff and the staff of Site Santa Fe and the CCA. Many of our attendees probably don't know that this was supposed to be a sort of half-day conference in person in Santa Fe. We would love to have seen you here, introduced you to New Mexican food if you don't already know it, though most of you already do. and the SAR campus, and of course Jason's Hostel Train 94, which will eventually open at site, but currently is on hold pending governor's reduction of restrictions about groups, aggregations of people. So I just continue to be amazed by everybody's flexibility and understanding as we work through these issues. Let me just end before we pull the plug here with a comment that came in from Barbara Rilke-Bauer. She says, I want to say thank you, SAR and the presenters, so much for this very informative webinar. The work that all the presenters are doing is so important, so creative, so inspiring, and I learned so much. This is anthropology and history at its best. So there you go. You get your props for a job well done. Anyway, thanks again. Say goodbye to everybody. Jason, I look forward to seeing you here in January. I think that's the plan. And CJ, I have a feeling our paths will cross before too long since you're a native New Mexican. And Ieva and Deborah, hope to see you here before too long, likewise. Okay, bye everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.